My name is Annabelle Noah, and this is the Women of Blue Collar America, Western Pennsylvania. In the words of author Kathleen Jamison, if everyone everywhere were to wake up tomorrow assuming that men and women ought to be treated the same way, a lot would change. A woman would not be scrutinized or questioned if she joins the same workforce that is dominated by men. Women would be licensed to leer at the anatomy of men or no longer be subject to similar scrutiny. She goes on to say, in any event, asking whether men and women are the same or different obscures the fact that both sameness and difference are in the eye of the beholder. Women made up a quarter of the US workforce by the early 20th century, but were beyond the range of being paid or treated fairly. There were efforts to correct the wage gap during World War II, when more women entered factory jobs while men enlisted in the military. There were attempts made, but it wasn't until the Equal Pay Act of 1963 that prohibited sex-based wage discrimination was prohibited. But the most important legal change was Title IX of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits employment discrimination based on sex, race, color, religion, and national origin. Almost 6 decades after Title IX, not all women are treated equally in the workforce. It seems some aspects of the workplace are still frozen in time. As a country, we've made some progress, but at least for several Western Pennsylvania women, the picture isn't so clear. They still experience inequality and overt discrimination daily. The law only opens the door. Each woman who starts work in a blue-collar job goes through that door alone to see what awaits for her on the other side. These are the stories of 10 women crossing that threshold. For this project, I interviewed 10 women in person or via Zoom. After the interviews were completed, I transcribed the audio into a Word document. For my research, I used a grounded theory methodology, meaning I wanted the women I interviewed to speak freely without much guidance from myself. By doing this, I was able to hear and see themes emerge. Women from different backgrounds and careers said similar insights working in blue-collar professions. From analyzing the themes, patterns began to emerge. I coded each pattern to its own category, a category that seemed important across the board from what the women said. Barbara Barnes is 71 years old, and she has been a retired sprinkler fitter for 17 years. She took her pension at 55, and by that time, she had been in her career for 25 years. Her father was a coal miner, and her mother stayed at home to raise 11 children. Barbara grew up helping her father cut hay and work outside. She and her siblings grew up working, but her father also really pushed them towards education. Barbara went to business school, but in 1979, she talked with her brother about jobs. Because he did taxes, he knew what many people made for a living. He said sprinkler fitters made good money, but they operated like a private boys' club. Barbara was undeterred. She took the sprinkler fitters test and got an interview. She passed the interview only after the man from the board and management teased her about wearing a miniskirt. On her first day, the guys watched her work and told her how there had been a girl before her who quit after 4 days. Barbara responded, obviously, she didn't need a job. Alexis is 29 years old and has been on the job 8 years. She's a firefighter and EMT. She grew up in Cleveland and then moved to Southern Ohio for her undergrad degree. She then went to North Carolina for graduate school, where she studied how to teach female resistance training. At the same time, she was also a volunteer firefighter. When she came to Pittsburgh to work on her PhD, she was studying how to train women in first response, along with sports nutrition. She applied to be a volunteer firefighter in the Pittsburgh suburb of Mount Lebanon and ended up leaving her PhD program. She then got a job working full-time as a firefighter and EMT at the Pittsburgh International Airport for 2 years. And she is now working full-time as a firefighter for the North Strabane Township Fire Department. Christy is 48 years old and has been in law enforcement for 28 years. She is from Washington County, just south of Pittsburgh, but has worked in Washington County for most of her career and is currently working in the neighborhood where she grew up. She got into law enforcement before she was even legally old enough to buy a beer. She started out working plainclothes, then working for a couple of different drug task forces. She is currently a deputy sheriff with the Washington County Sheriff's Department, as well as a canine handler / canine deputy. Christy stays active by taking extra training classes such as interviewing and interrogation classes. She was selected to teach a few classes for the Liquor Control Board. She says, "So, you're only as good as what you were trained to do." Carol is 73 years old and was a union organizer for 30 years before retiring 8 years ago. She's originally from New Jersey, but then moved to Pittsburgh after college. In the mid-70s, she began at the Heinz plant, but was there for less than a year before she started at the mine. She worked at the mine for 4 years until she had a serious injury that ended her career there. She then began union organizing. She was on the road a lot, helping others meet all the necessary requirements to gain union recognition. Carrie is 37 years old and is a lieutenant for the Pittsburgh Fire Department. She grew up in North Huntington Township, 18 miles from Pittsburgh. 17 years ago, while she was a sophomore in college, she began volunteer firefighting for the nearby Holiday Park Fire Department. She earned a degree in criminal justice and eventually studied to be a full-time firefighter. She began working at the Pittsburgh Fire Department 8 years ago and has been a lieutenant for almost 3 years. Asia is 37 years old and has been in law enforcement for over 10 years. She is originally from Brooklyn, New York, where her mother was a corrections officer at Rikers Island. Asia came to Pittsburgh in 2002 to go to Pitt. She has a BA in criminal justice and her BS in psychology. Her first job with the Pittsburgh Police was on the north side doing patrol. She moved into the gang violence unit where she started her detective work there. She then became a homicide detective in 2020. Anne is 70 years old and first started working at the Rubbermaid facility in Wooster, Ohio for 26 years, while also being a union activist and being elected the first female president of the local union, which later joined with the Steelworkers. She came to work at the Steelworkers headquarters in Pittsburgh in November 1998. She originally worked in the union's political and legislative education department. She has been in Women of Steel since 2006. This department teaches women how to become union activists. Steffi is 70 years old and graduated in 1975 with an economics degree. She saw that many of the jobs that were available to women didn't pay well. So she came to Pittsburgh and started working at Clairton Works U.S. Steel in 1976. At U.S. Steel, Steffi was a janitor and then became an electrician apprentice. Steffi was also involved with the United Steelworkers of America Local 1557. In 1981, there were industry-wide shutdowns and layoffs within U.S. Steel, and that affected Steffi's job. Afterward, she started studying filmmaking at the Art Institute. She later produced the documentary Women of Steel in 1985, which showed the struggles the laid-off female steelworkers faced after being let go. She is currently a labor educator for the steelworkers. Liz is 72 years old and is originally from Boston but moved to Pittsburgh in 1975. She started working at the mine in Finleyville, which is south of Pittsburgh, in 1977. Her husband did a work study with the United Mine Workers and worked there the whole time he was in law school. Liz and her husband would go to several of the strikes. That's how she became interested and then applied to the mines. Liz was there less than 3 years because she gave birth to her daughter, who was born prematurely and had a lot of medical complexities. Liz worked through her pregnancy, but stopped so that she could take care of her daughter. Patricia is originally from Iowa. She received her doctorate degree at the University of Illinois, and her first job was at the University of Miami. She moved to Pittsburgh in 1991. Patricia is the co-founder of the Women and Girls Foundation of Southwest Pennsylvania and started in Sisterhood, the women's movement, in 2008, where they interviewed 85 people and created 3 different multimedia exhibits. Patricia is a progressive social scientist, film student, and is a visiting scholar in women's studies at the University of Pittsburgh. Her research focuses on women's issues. She interviewed women who were the first wave of women in blue-collar professions. She looked at what was going on in the 70s as a consequence of the Civil Rights Act with blue-collar jobs integrating. In my interviews with these 10 women who have lived and worked in the Pittsburgh area, a reoccurring theme emerged. Few worked in these positions. Those who do feel isolated. And some of the women get along fine with many of the men they work beside, but for most working in an all-boys club feel lonely.
Same guy, Ron Carswell, he nominated me for financial secretary because Tom Mahan, who had been for probably 30 years, okay, so Ron Carswell nominated me, my brother. That's who I got along the most, like out in the field. And I never worked with women. I mean, like there was two other ones, Michelle and Sandy. Very rarely were we ever on the same job. They, all girls would do is just talk. But I couldn't even talk with the lady electricians because they're all busy. There was totally depressing isolation. Totally depressing isolation. I will tell you something. I was the first woman in 1979. Sandy Connors, she's in Florida now. She's 10 years younger than me. She got in probably 1985, maybe. They never got a woman in since. Nope. Never got one in since.
It's been a ride. I will say there's definitely the pressure of being a woman. There's 4 of us out of 650 roughly. It's probably a little higher than that, but we sort of stick around 650. There was 6 when I got on, 2 have since retired, and it's, I guess lucky for me, I had worked in a also male-dominated field when I did, remodeling. So there's like an adjustment period. I think for anyone there is, but definitely longer for a woman, just because you have to get to know each other, what I'm comfortable with, what they're comfortable with.
It is very male-dominated. The region itself, I don't know the exact amount, but there's only, I want to say there's less than 10 working female firefighters, as in like career, like it is their career, they get paid for it, in like the entire Pittsburgh region. As far as like both volunteer and career, so at the airport it was me and one other girl. They've had 4 girls total there in their whole history. I think I was the 4th. Here, I am the first female career firefighter. They've never had one before me, part-time or full-time. But we actually have quite a few female volunteers here, which is really nice.
We came to Pittsburgh in 1991. It was reeling from deindustrialization. And everything was focused on men, and men had lost their jobs. Women had lost their jobs, Post-World War II, you have increasing number of women going to college. You have no jobs for women here. And you really need to be thinking about changing the economic structure here so that it's more diversified. And they didn't do it. And so when the steel industry failed, the women who had gotten blue-collar jobs were out of their jobs. And thousands and thousands of men were out of their job. But the sympathy was for the male workers. The men had lost their jobs. There wasn't sympathy for women losing their jobs. And the jobs that were available for women were pink-collar jobs.
There's 2 of us girls here, and there's probably 40 male deputies and probably 2 females. But in their defense, not a lot of people, period, want to do this job anymore, let alone women. And quite honestly, my daughter, she wanted to go to school. She's like, well, I shut her down because I know what I've seen. I know I've changed, and I don't want her to see that. But the truth of the matter is most of the cops that are coming up through now, they're 2nd or 3rd generation. The only ones that want to do this job anymore seem to be those that have been around law enforcement. It's in I hate to say it, but it's in their blood. I mean, who wants to give up holidays, nights, and weekends? Who wants to come into work and go, oh, hey, by the way, you're stuck here for another 8 hours when you had plans with your family? You're either in it because you truly want to be in it, or your career is short-lived.
I have to be honest, I think everybody's put on earth for a reason. Like there's a purpose for your life, and I feel like I'm working in my purpose. There aren't a lot of African American detectives, and there's not a lot of female detectives in this office. There are currently 3 females, so myself, another black female, and a white female. There's 2 robbery detectives, 1 white female. And then in our GVI unit, our gang unit, there are no females at all. So it's very, very limited. There were times where I would go to a scene and someone would be like, oh my God, there's a black female cop. I've never seen a black female cop. So I always told people sometimes I'm like a unicorn. And it's true, because I was the only black female cop working the streets in the zone at the time. So we have at least 80 to 100 officers, and I was the only black female working in patrol. So sometimes being a black female and a mom will help me in a situation.
All of these women wear required uniforms to work, and these uniforms are meant to keep them safe in different ways. But most of these blue-collar women have to make changes to their uniform, sometimes because it isn't designed for their female bodies. But men's and women's pants are different. While men's pants are straight, women's pants are cut with more curvature and more width in the hips. Some of the women have to go out and purchase their own work shirts and pants, or have what they were given tailored so that they can be comfortable.
There was a lot. You had to have steel-toed shoes, and because it was, sometimes you'd be working in a place that was really wet, and sometimes you'd be working in a place that was dry. So you had to have these steel-toed rubber boots that came up to your knee, and very hard, it was very, very, very hard to find women's sizes, or sizes that women could wear, because at that point women didn't do those jobs. There weren't specific clothes, but depending on what you were doing, I mean, you always just got filthy, but depending on, like, if you're in a real wet place, you might wear different things. And when I was working out on the haulage, it was really cold, so you really needed to have lots of layers, and you learn to like dress in layers. Mostly I would wear overalls, with long underwear, a flannel shirt or some kind of a shirt. And you had your hat that had the clip in the front that your light went in, and your light had a cable that ran off of it.
Women in safety equipment, because it's still an issue. A commonly understood problem that sort of like all the medical research that's been done on most of the diseases, been done on white men. So if you're going to find about medical conditions, you better be a white man, because that's where the research is. Because if you're a female or a person of color, the research may or may not apply. So the same thing goes for safety equipment, is that the stuff isn't made for our bodies necessarily. And we'd have gloves, so we were always really oversized. Like I told you, the boots, I found boots that fit me, and that was not a problem because of my big feet and my big body for the yellow suit. But then we had to have helmets and glasses. You had to have safety glasses, and then respirators. I mean, everything fit me okay, but smaller women would have trouble with boots, with pants being too long, and in all cases, in terms of industry, you have to be aware of where things could catch. And if you Google Women of Steel, the trouble is that my video is called Women of Steel that we made in the 80s. Anyway, it opens up with a woman taking off her yellows and all her steelworker clothes, the boots and the gloves and the hat, the helmet and all this stuff, the glasses. No respirator in this case because she's working in that kind of situation. And then putting on stockings and makeup and a little apron and becoming a waitress, because that's basically what happened. I had been working got into the mill and then got out, forced out when the mill's closed.
Okay, so our regular uniform is navy blue pants, navy blue shirt. We have officers wear white collared shirts, firefighters wear blue. So that's for, we go down to training, which they kind of divide the uniforms into class. There's class A, B, C, station uniforms. Station uniforms, the navy blue t-shirts and pants. Class A is the full get-up, the blue, the nice blue pants, the blue button down. A fire, that would be bunker pants, bunker jacket, helmet, gloves, face mask, and our SCBA. SCBA, self-contained breathing apparatus. Those go on our backs. So if I actually go in a fire, then I would go on air. The total combined weight is like over 50 pounds. Yeah, so it's getting better. When I was in the academy, so the city pays for like our initial uniforms, except for our t-shirts. Like when I was getting sized for like all my dress uniforms and all my other stuff, the specs that the city gives the uniform shop are all for men. So I had to like the button downs. They're all men's uniforms, and I had to get my sleeves had to get tailored, my sides had to get tailored, my pants. I actually now wear Dickies female pants. So I found some, and there's companies that are coming out with more and more stuff, but our city specs are still for the men, so I always have to make adjustments to them.
So that depends on the day, and it depends on what you're doing. Here at North Strabane, it pretty much the base uniform, is your duty pants, your boots, and then a polo. We do have like what we call our Class B with the metal on it. As far as like any fire call or vehicle accident, that's where you start to get into like, well, you have all your turnout gear, your pants, your boots, your coat, your helmet, gloves, and then obviously for a fire, any sort of situation like that where you can't breathe necessarily, you have your SCBA is what we call it. So PPE wise, it's funny, we just did like rescue training my last couple weeks at the airport. And harnesses, it's just different, right? Because, men have a certain body type, and a lot of it's made for both men and women, or it's like the size is kind of universal, or there's just one size there. And so you're like cinching stuff down in places where they don't have to, and it's more painful then because you can't get the harness tight where it needs to be tight, and so you have to find your own ways around some of it. So like SCBAs, women tend to have smaller upper bodies and their hips, and this is even in a lot of military research with the rucking. So women tend to put a lot of stress on their hips and their knees and all this other stuff because just their body joints and the angles of them and all this other stuff, it's different than a man. And so with the SCBA, it's really easy to cinch down the shoulder straps. So like upper body wise, if you have a good upper body, you're carrying that thing like no problem. But after a while, your back starts to hurt. And so you go to cinch the hip straps down, and I remember in my academy when we were wearing it all the time, it took an act of God to get it tight enough to where it wasn't like, could actually sit it on my hips, which is where it was comfortable.
Okay, so obviously the uniform itself, pants and shirt, boots. Some places require steel-toed boots. We don't. I can honestly tell you, 28 years, I have no desire to wear steel-toed boots. I understand why. I'm not, saying you shouldn't. It's just a preference. So our boots, and then our duty gear, our belt, and all of our tools that come with it. On mine, I have my belt. On my belt, I have obviously my holster and my gun, extra magazines for my weapon, pepper spray, handcuffs, radio and a radio holder. And then we're required here to wear our bulletproof vests, whether we wear it internally like I have one right now or externally in an external carrier. But that's required, which is good. They absolutely save lives. Are they the most comfortable? Hell no. But you know what? I'd rather be alive and a little uncomfortable than not around to see my kid have kids. I'm not gonna lie, I still wear men's pants and I still wear men's cut shirts. I'm not a little girl. They make them for a more feminine cut. The women's pants seem to be cut a little bit shorter in the waist. Listen, man, I had a baby. I don't have a little waist. I don't, you develop differently. So the women's shirts are cut more narrow through the waist. Again, I don't need that. But I don't like anything tight either. When I like braid them. But it's cool because they've come a long way. Like when I first started and like with our agencies, we were what they were called Class A's. They were polyester. They were cold in the winter, they were hot in the summer, they were miserable. Now most places are going with, what we call BDUs, which is like a military style cut, which is kind of nice because they're a little bit roomier in the rear end and in the thighs, so you can move around a little bit with the pockets, you can carry extra things in there.
We didn't have to wear uniforms, and matter of fact, we could wear shorts most of the time because it was so hot. It was over 100 degrees in the plant most of the time. So we were one of the rare factories that you could wear shorts and sleeveless tops and as little as possible because it was so hot in there. In our particular department, there were no dress codes. You did have to have safety glasses, which were an issue at times, steel-toe shoes, and gloves, hearing, but they didn't care what clothes you wore, so we didn't have uniforms. But if you worked in the rubber department where they mixed the rubber, they had the white zip-up cover-ups that they wore so they wouldn't get the compound on their clothes and things and take it home. First, women couldn't even bid on those jobs. Eventually, women realized they could get into skilled trades. And so I remember seeing the women that were on those jobs wearing some pretty baggy coveralls and ill-fitted. And they would cut and sew them and adapt them to what they needed. I had problems with women's gloves being too small for my long fingers, and they bought small for women. And so all the women on these machines, you know, whether you were a big woman or a small woman, you had this one size glove. And I found that I was having to cut in between just to fit the gloves on my hands.
It's difficult especially for a female. So we're obviously built different. So when I was in the academy, we got fitted for our vest. So we had a female come down and take our measurements. And vests, they want to stop at a certain point where you're sitting down, so they have to stop at a certain point. But you know, it's difficult if you're bustier, you know, so it's difficult, and vests are so uncomfortable. And having a gun belt, you can't just go to any restroom because, you know, it's not just, you know, I have to take my gun belt down or I have to take it off to go to the restroom. So it's not as easy being a female. When you go to the public safety supply store, it's okay, well, we have these sizes and these shirts or pants in the female department, but you might like this in a larger size or in a smaller size in the men's department because you're so limited on your option. And then sometimes the female pants just aren't cut right if you're a little curvier. If you're like straight up and down, okay, it might fit and it might be good, but if you're curvier like me, it's uncomfortable. I have my riot gear downstairs in my locker. I have my gas mask, my helmet, a patrol uniform. I do have that downstairs just in case I do have to come out of this suit and jump into a uniform. But more pants because they do not last long. You got thicker thighs, that material, that rubbing. Now you got holes all up and down your pants, and I'm just being honest. Like, I have blown through some uniform pants quickly.
For some blue-collar occupations, paid pregnancy leave is written into the contract. But for most of these women, pregnancy leave is specified. And some said they wouldn't know what the department would do if they became pregnant. Federal law states that pregnant women cannot be fired or excluded from being hired. But that didn't stop some employers from trying to push women out of the job, saying they couldn't do the work while they were pregnant, or telling them the job no longer existed when they came back from maternity leave.
All of a sudden I figured out, I guess I'm pregnant. Got married only because I did not need a husband. Didn't need him whatsoever. And I needed to keep the job. And I needed to be over on Washington Boulevard. It's a fire training center, but that's where I went to school. 2 nights a week, you couldn't miss. So then when they found out I was pregnant, so I was working down at Wonder Cells, which is down in West Elizabeth. It was a warehouse cells. And I was in the warehouse, and we were putting sprinklers in the racks. So I was there with 2 old guys and another apprentice guy. And I wore bib overalls. They didn't know me from Adam because they didn't know if I was chunky or what? Because in the winter, I wore like an army coat, over my bibs. And so then two people, they come down. They says, oh, you're pregnant. Are you pregnant? I go, yeah. And they says, well, you're going to have to quit. Okay, Jimmy Carter, 1978. Can't discriminate against pregnant women. The piece of shit guy, he wasn't even the foreman. Piece of crap. He decided that my job would be to take 5-gallon cans, put them in the truck bed, drive the truck down to the gas station, fill them up, then come back and gas up the rigs. Well, I'm not stupid. Obviously, if you're pregnant, you shouldn't be like huffing and puffing gas. So my doctor signed me off so I worked till I was 7.5 months. Now, I was sworn in when I was 6 months pregnant. I made it through my apprenticeship. So I called up down to National Automatic Sprinkler Industry, NASI, like their health and welfare down in D.C. Well, they don't know how to treat this. They go, it's not an accident. And I said, no. They go, it's not an illness. No. Well, if it's an accident, you get from day one. If it's an illness, you got to wait a week. So I had a waiting week with no money. So then I had it for 6 weeks. And then at the 6-week point when I went in for my checkup, my doctor knew what I did. So he said, I'll give you 6 more. So I was off, which was nice. So I go back to work in September. Well, I call up the because that's how you get your job. I says, oh, I'm ready to go back to work. He said, I don't have anywhere to send you. That's what he said. So I called. They said, no, we don't have anything for you. So I go down south side. There was an employment office down there. So I go and I sign up. They're even assholes down there because I'm off work. I got my baby with me. I'm going to spend. They go, well, you can't bring her here. What if you have a job to send us? I said, you know what? If you have a job to send me to, I says, I'm not dressed. I got on tennis shoes. I said, I'm not dressed to go to work. I said, I'll take my baby to the sitter and I'll go and get dressed for this job. Do you got one for me? No. So I'm waiting for unemployment to kick in. It's denied. He said that I quit. So now I have to appeal it. And you know what they told me? They says, you could sue him. And I says, I ended up getting it, the lump of it. I ended up getting called to work and I got sent out to Monroeville Mall at the conference center that you drive under. So it's me and a couple other guys and for the company. He said to me, how come some days your boobs are big and other days they aren't? I was nursing my daughter, which I had to quit that because there was no place to pump milk. There was no place to put it. There was no privacy, like they weren't going to say, yeah, you can sit in your car for half an hour and bring out your cooler. And
some of the bosses didn't want to have me on the crew once I was getting bigger. For a while, I got assigned to shovel that coal, just keep it clean. And so that meant you're by yourself all day. You don't see anyone else. They drop you off at the beginning of the shift. They pick you up at the end of the shift. And I guess they, thought that was safer. And then one time they came back to pick me up and all the shoveling, and then I'm supposed to put this rock dust down, to make, so everything was shoveled. I'd finished up everything. The mining had finished. And I had a little hubby place for whoever does that had a little bit of protection around it, and it had a little heater. And I'd gone back and I was in there with the heater waiting for them to come and get me, and I fell asleep, and you're never allowed to fall asleep in a mine. So that was like a big deal. So that was, I had a grievance. I wound up sometimes getting jobs like that, getting stuck on things, and I would rather be working with a crew.
Pregnancy has to be treated like any other disability. So if you have a workplace policy or a union contract that covers you when you're physically unable to work, then it covers you when you are physically unable to work due to pregnancy. But no, there's no federal or state law that I know of that grants a pregnancy and then there's parental leave. That was definitely my experience in the mine workers union. The union officials, they dealt with 97% of the workforce with white males. They didn't know or care about that stuff. And so having an advocacy organization for women in that profession was really important.
I've actually asked I'm not really sure if I'm ever going to have kids. I don't really know at this point. I'm kind of getting up there. And I have looked into it just out of sheer curiosity, and there's no policy. There's nothing that's really, and that's another thing I think that I feel like it would be addressed when it comes up. There is no specific policy for it. It's called, like, if I got pregnant, I could pretty much work up until I decide I don't want to, and then and then honestly, I don't know what they would do with me up until up until that woman or whoever would have the baby. I don't know. There's nothing. Like, would I have to use my own time? I have no idea. Would they put me, say, downtown in an office job, which we don't have any light duty jobs technically. So that kind of gives you an idea of where the fire department is with women.
So you look at a lot of contracts right now, they don't all account for women having to take pregnancy leave, especially not adequate pregnancy leave. And it's not like another job where you're not taking leave until 8 months in. You can't be in a smoke-filled area when you are pregnant from the start, much like breastfeeding and stuff like that afterwards. So your leave time, unless your contract is accounting for that, you may very well not be getting, the adequate amount of leave time or pay for it. So that's in the works. A lot of places are getting better at that, but that's still something that's in some areas women are fighting for, I guess you could say.
These women want to be reassured that the men they work with have their backs on the job that could be dangerous. It makes the workday a little better knowing there is someone you can talk to and express whatever is going on in the job, since they will understand. But some women felt like the black sheep on the job. Some met up with other women in the profession, but from different stations or unions. They wanted to speak with people who understood what they were experiencing and to gain insight.
For me, it was in 1999 that, for whatever reason, there was this Coalition of Labor Union Women, CLUW, CLUW. There's a Pittsburgh chapter. It was established in 1974, this Coalition of Labor Union Women in Chicago. And obviously, it was mostly women's job unions. But the one woman said about George Meany, and we didn't come here to swap recipes. And you know what? Seriously, so this is the Pittsburgh chapter. They sent letters to all the unions wanting you to nominate a woman for the Hall of Fame. And it was a brunch, and So Michelle, my union sister, and we both went. Decided, I'm going to check this out. Well, gee whiz. I didn't know there was I just didn't know. I never worked with women. I'm saying I didn't feel any sisterhood. So I felt a real sisterhood.
And it all kind of ties together, like having more women in the field. It's becoming more of a thing where I think we're talking with each other about it more. And we're like, hey, is this normal? No, it's not normal. Like, you can go say something. And actually, I'm going to go say something with you, and we're going to get this taken care of, because you should never volunteer career, whatever you are, that should never be a thing. And I don't care if it's at your station or training, or even if it's meant as a joke. The way that my one fire chief up in Mount Lebanon, he always says, jokes are great, but you need to be careful because everyone has their boundary.
Black women were really tight. In the police force, the black women had each other's backs. They met regularly and talked. And they knew what was going on. They knew who to look out for, how to handle things. They gave each other advice. The white women didn't, in the 70s, the white women didn't do that. And I don't know if that has changed. But the white women didn't feel they needed it. There's a racial element. One, you get harassment. But two, it's what kind of a support system do you put in place? And now, for instance, Barbara was the only woman in her union, but she was from a union family, let me tell you. So she understood the culture, and her brothers and her uncles could give her advice on how to handle the culture.
Some of the women said they do have a good work relationship with the men they work beside, but it isn't the case for all of them. Some joked and said sometimes you just have to laugh off the bad treatment they encouraged. Others said they had to take it on the chin and move on. Some were told they only got the job because they are a woman. If the women were fighting for a female issue, the men weren't interested. Some men only wanted to talk about issues that could impact them personally.
Okay, so I get up for the interview, and there's like 3 guys that are sprinkler fitters that's on the board, and then there's 3 guys from management, from the companies. One of them said, well, when you work with me, you're gonna have to wear a mini skirt so I can hold the ladder. This is 1979. Then another guy says to me, well, you're gonna hear some coarse language. I said, you know what? I could be sitting on a bar stool any day, any night of the week, and hear coarse language and not being paid. I had all these other guys, coming, watching me work, And then they said to me, one of the guys in my union, oh, we had a girl before, but after 4 days she quit. And I says, obviously she didn't need a job.
Learned a lot of smart ways of working, a lot of smart ways of doing things like that, and had some really good friends, some folks that I really stayed close with long after the time that I stopped working. I continued to know them and have some contact with them. But there was a real sense of camaraderie because, you really have to look out for one another. Everybody knows you're in a place where serious accidents could happen. And there were some while I worked there. A friend of mine who worked on a different shift lost her leg.
Yeah, they didn't think we should be there, right? So that they weren't going to do anything to help us make it easy for us to be there. And I didn't have the papers, but I was working with someone who did have the papers. They brought in a new piece of equipment, and instead of 1 boom on the machine, there were now 2 booms on the machine, so each of you could be operating a bolter. And the company decided that this was a new job and a new position, and they were going to require both people to have papers. I was going to lose my job that bid, and I just remember getting ready to come out of the mine one day, and the pit committee guy, who's the union committee guy, got off the elevator, and he said, they're going to try to take you off of that bid. He said, but don't worry, we're going to fight for you. And it wasn't because it was so shocking to hear that, because I had never, on something that was a woman's issue, we never had their backing. The guys, when we were trying to win the pregnancy, leave, disability leave, the guys cared nothing about it. Nothing. They really did not care at all about anything that had particular need, but they got it that if they could do that to me, they could do it to them. Just to have heard that from the committeemen when they had never backed anything that was about a women's issue, that they understood that they needed to fight for me was a revelation. It really was.
And I've had this conversation with one of the other females, and we kind of joke around about it, but there's levels of how well I know somebody, what you can get away with, what, we can talk about, if I'm friends with you, we can probably have more of a private conversation or joke around or be a little bit more funny versus somebody that I don't really know. If they make an inappropriate comment, it's totally different than somebody that I'm really good friends with in the same, fire department and or shift, but depending on the crowd and who's there, it's like every day I go through that. So it's a balancing act, I will say, as far as dealing with men every day goes and how I can deal with them. And it's hard to explain, but I think I kind of explained it. The levels.
You definitely get that in the field, 100%. And it is very difficult because, so I'll preface this because I always like to preface when I'm talking about this that I've been very lucky, very lucky. I started in Mount Lebanon, where the chief straight up pulled me into his office when I first started and said, if you ever have a problem or you ever feel disrespected or you ever need to talk, because I know that your experience is going to be different in this field. And he said, I am aware of that, and I can't necessarily say that I understand what you're going to experience because I am a man. He said, but I want you to know that you can always come into my office and you can talk about it. I will do whatever I can, because he's like, I don't know that you'll experience it as much here, meaning in the station, but you go to fire classes, you go to training, you go to other fire departments, you see other departments on scene. He can control the culture of his department. He can't necessarily control the culture of everyone that I'm to experience. I went to the airport where the chief at the airport, he has always been one of my biggest supporters, and he made it very clear. I remember one day, it becomes a joke. Sometimes you joke about it, and sometimes I think that's been like a coping mechanism for me. Having had people outside of my departments that are like, you only have your job because you're a lady. You're only successful because you're a woman. You know that, like, if you get promoted, it's only going to be because you're, like, people straight up will tell you that, and they'll be dead serious. Unfortunately, I've experienced it, and I've helped other girls who have experienced it, and it is a very common thing between just an overall general disrespect about being a female in the fire service. But then even, like, sexual harassment is a pretty big... Thankfully, like, sexual assault is becoming less and less of a thing, I would say, because you start to have all these protective measures in place and training, and girls are getting a little bit better about speaking up sometimes. I know a lot of women are still very scared, usually, because that comes with the stigma, right? Most of these situations are very, like, did they mean it how I took it? Am I just reading into this? Because that felt very... It felt a lot like sexual harassment, and it felt a lot like disrespect, but am I just being too sensitive is what it comes down to. I think women are becoming more willing to say stuff or speak up or accepting of the fact that, like, you don't have to just always, like, you don't have to sit there and take it. But at the same time, I mean, I've been involved in situations where nothing was done. Whether it was me or somebody else, people knew about it and nothing was done. Or people knew about it and they thought it was funny. And it's just like, that's just, like I said, thankfully in my departments, it's not really been a thing where I'm faced with it every day, but it is very much, I mean, still a problem. But then I actually started to do research, and, like, the amount of women in the fire service or, like, police, EMS that kill themselves because of this stuff, like, suicide is becoming a bigger problem. I'm really passionate about, especially, like, as I go through the field, because I've even ended up sending, like, an email out to all the women that I know in the fire service, well enough to send this email to, and just told them, like, hey, if I sent them an article that at the time had just come out about another girl who killed herself because of sexual assault and stuff in her fire department. I was like, hey, you know, you don't have to because keeping it a secret is absolutely detrimental, both to your mental, physical, emotional health, all of that, but it's also detrimental to the culture as a whole, and it's detrimental to women coming into that. This boundary you have to walk, where, like, you have to admit that this stuff happens, and it shouldn't happen. And it doesn't mean that all men are bad, and it doesn't mean that all firemen are bad, and it doesn't mean that men don't know how to act or men are disrespectful or whatever else. There are people, and one person can ruin for a group of people. And that's one thing that I've had to, you know, because when I've been vocal about it before, I've gotten some kickback in certain areas where I've been vocal about how it shouldn't be tolerated and how it's terrible that women are treated that way. And I had a guy tell me, well, I don't know why you're making such a big deal out of it, because most of the men treat you well. And I was like, yes, but this small circle of names that I can list did not, and that significantly affected me.
I interviewed 8 police officers, 4 white and 4 black. The white women typically didn't have the same level of problems that the black women had. I mean, there was a lot of sexism and racism that overlapped. And it was the black woman who told me she always handled it informally. And I think the sexism varied by the field. For instance, miners, the women miners I spoke to had really close relationships with their colleague. And, you know, you go down there and everybody has to have each other's back when you're underground. And that context really fostered a closeness. The steel workers were trying to work with the people in the building trades. And a huge difference in terms of their work experience, and this was Steffi's insight, that when you're working in the mills or in the mines, you work with the same people every day. You're on a shift, you work with the same people, and you develop relationships with people, and they learn your competencies or incompetencies and vice versa, and that impacts your relationships. In the building trades, people work on projects. Maybe your project lasts 6 months and then you go to another one, and you might be with a totally different team of people on the next project. So you don't develop those long-term trusting relationships. It was more difficult to change the culture of the building trades and the way they worked. And I think of the women I talked to, some of them had some very good relationships with their colleagues. Certainly not all of them. And there didn't seem to be any incentive in the unions for the men to respect female colleagues or to make the culture more inclusive and respectful, I would say. I heard this in the police department, that one woman said, nobody's going to get me off this job. And she said, if I report it, there will be retaliation. And she said, here's one thing that might happen. I'm out in the field and something's coming down and I need backup. If I've reported them, I'm not going to get backup. I'm going to let her deal with the situation. So what she said was she always handled it informally. And at the time, there was a woman who was head of the Pittsburgh Human Relations Commission. She was also an extremely prominent Black woman in the community, a leader. And she said they would talk to her, and then she would go directly to the safety director and say, this is going on. What are we going to do about it? Then hopefully he would take action. It's always he. So and I know women who handled it directly, any kind of harassment in the police department, got a reputation. Women, of course, were treated horribly, but it was how they responded to the situation. And if you handled it informally and if you had access to someone in power who would be listened to, then you never had to report on it in writing. But if you confronted people about it and reported them to their superiors, that would get you in trouble. I can imagine that that's still valid.
No, I don't know, and I was hoping that things would have changed a lot, but they're not. It's not changed much in 28 years. You're not accepted. I laugh. I tell any new girl that comes in here, you can go out and drink with them all you want. You'll never be one of the guys. There'll always be a competitiveness. There'll always be unhappy girlfriends or wives that just don't want you around, even if you're doing nothing wrong. You're just not accepted. And I don't know how to bridge that gap. I wish I did, but you're not. It's a really uncomfortable feeling, I don't know what the answer is. So it's kind of been an uphill battle for my entire career. And I've always run into the attitude like, there's certain things that the guys can do better than we can. There's certain things we can do better. The whole thing is it should be a team concept, but it's just not viewed that way often. And I hate to say that, but like to defend my male counterparts, they've been around females that, have taken advantage of the fact and pulled the quote female card. And that's not fair either. So like the whole understand, like I wish I could say like an open communication, but all that normally leads to is hurt feelings in a more miserable work environment. Trust my dog. Yeah, I trust my dog. And I'm just going to let it go at that.
Like I said, sometimes as a female, it will work out for me. I'll have a connection with the mom or, someone who's on scene that needs help and I can understand what they're going through. And then sometimes somebody will see that as, aha, this is my moment. Act up, cut up, do whatever I'm going to do. I always think to myself, my backup will be here soon. I just have to stay in this fight. I'm always here and I'm always trying to help someone. So with that, a lot of people appreciate that and they will have my back. I don't ever have to worry about my safety or that someone's not going to have my back. I've never worried about that.
Most of these women love what they do. If they experience indifference or harassment, they deal with it because they're doing what they love. Some are trying to make a difference for future women to come. They want to get more women to join the job, Experiencing discrimination and inequality has made these women stronger and more determined to show that they can do the job. They will not be pushed out.
So one night, okay, so I'm fabbing the material, I'm on the outside, and you have to, like feed it through well, I guess I was taking too long. We're with walkie-talkies. Where's that pipe, you cunt? Oh, yeah. Now, this is 1990. What am I going to do, file a complaint? Yeah, that's pretty much the gist of it. It was pretty shitty. But, you know what my motto was? If I'm going to leave my kids for 40 hours a week, plus minimum 10 hours of drive time, I'm going to make the most amount of money I can, and I'm going to get me health care, and I'm going to get me a pension. Like I said, that's what I learned from Grandpa. You get a pension if you're in a union. But I eventually got to be the first woman officer. Like, a black guy nominated me one time during elections to be on the finance committee.
But the benefit of being where I'm at now is I've gotten to work with new firefighters that have graduated from the academy. I guess I feel I'm successful if they are successful. So at least in my position now, for them to thrive and succeed and do well within this job and hopefully love this job, because not everyone loves this job. There are people that it's a job for some. It's, hey, I go to work, I make money, I go home. It's more than just a job for me. I love this job.
Like, I know I have that sense of responsibility when I'm in the courthouse to all those workers in there, not just because my daughter's up there, but like I genuinely care about those people that work up there and I don't want anything to happen to them. And I think if you come into work and you don't have that mentality, you probably should find another job. My whole attitude was like, you're never going to change what I want to do. Like, this is in me. This is all I've ever wanted to do since I was a kid. And because I played sports my whole life. So like my drive's a little bit different than most. You're going to tell me I can't. That's all the more reason why I will.
The only reason I still love my job, regardless of the sexual harassment or the people who tell me I'm only in it because I'm a girl or whatever. The only reason I still love my job is because I love the job, genuinely just love the job. And so I don't tell people to just be firefighters, because at the end of the day, when you do experience those things, you want to love your job so much that it becomes, well, I know that they said that stuff to me, but I don't even care because I just genuinely love my job. Or, I know that they said that stuff to me, but I don't care because I know I can do my job.
That has proven to be good for me as a female. It has not stopped my share of fights. Sometimes when you have someone that is focused on fighting or being aggressive or even under the influence of drugs, then it does not help me in a situation. I have had where I've gone into a situation and being an African American officer, I've been called, an Uncle Tom. I've been called by, I remember a white female, she called me the N-word attached with the B-word. And she did that the whole entire ride to jail. So there are certain aspects where it helps me and certain aspects where it hurts me. I have to be honest, I think everybody's put on earth for a reason. Like there's a purpose for your life, and I feel like I'm working in my purpose.
Little outside support exists for women in these industries. Women within the jobs have to be their own support systems. What is the answer to making women in blue collar safe? Or how to get more women into these types of careers?
Oh, I decided I would apply to work in the mines. And it was pretty, there were very few women, but it was really, we had this national gathering it's where Rosa Parks went to train before Rosa Parks sat down on the bus. But it was either in Kentucky or Tennessee, and we all gathered there and, we shared our experiences and figured out how, because for so many women, it was the only way for them to have, in the communities they lived in, it was the only way that they were going to be able to support their children. So most of the women who were working in the mine were single. They weren't, they were divorced and they had children to support. And there wasn't any other way in their community that they could afford to do that. So it was felt like a pretty powerful group of women to be a part of, I think you can do it, but I think it it feels in some ways like you need to know somebody else who's done it so that it seems like, oh yeah, that's doable. Yeah, I could do that. But I think a lot of the apprenticeship programs are one of the best ways for women to get in, but it's very limited. It's the building trades. Like there's no apprenticeship program to be a miner or to be a steel worker or to be a, other industrial jobs.
I, as a union organizer, was involved in negotiating contracts in places where it was mostly women workers, and it was still a fight for that. Employers aren't going to do anything that you don't make them do, period. Right? I mean, you'd be organizing a union and the employer would do some kind of wacko thing that was clearly illegal. And the workers would come in and they say, can they do that? And I'm like, they just did, The question is, not can they do it, but what are you going to do about it?
The problem with that would be you have to be okay with physical work and you have to be okay with getting dirty. And you have to be okay with spending 24 hours with all men. I don't know how to attract, I would say there's a certain type that you're targeting, and it's such a small group of women that it's hard to get to. Plus, currently we have to live in the city. So most of the women that I know that are into firefighting and like it and would actually do this job live outside the city and are all volunteers at volunteer fire stations. I was always active, always liked doing physical stuff. So if you could find, military backgrounds for sure, girls that like to go, work out, like to do kind of physical stuff. That's kind of a start. Girls that if you're like upset if you're going to break a nail, this job probably isn't for that woman. There's a select group, and it's hard to kind of get to that. Simply, like most women just don't want to do this job. I think it's the best job in the world. I absolutely love it. It suits me, but it doesn't suit a big percentage of women. Oh, add on to that, another issue is most of our stations don't have female quarters. And female quarters didn't affect me as much because if I was the officer, I have my own office, I have my own place. And it does not bother me where I sleep at all. And I've always worked with respectful men, and it's never been an issue. But there's no station within this district that has a separate facilities for women. A lot of these stations are super old, and they're not built for male and female. It's one, where we sleep is one giant room, shared facilities, shared restrooms or whatever. So we kind of cohabitate, and there's really no place for, a woman to have her own little space if she wanted to. There are some stations that do have them, but if you hire a woman and tell them, hey, sorry, there's, you have to sleep with the men, I know there's some that would be uncomfortable with it. It does not bother me whatsoever, but I think as a whole, it would definitely bother some, and that could be like a major deterrence. We've come a long way from obviously the last woman officer. I know things are different nowadays than they were back then, for sure, but there's still a bunch of stuff that could be improved upon. Especially, this is a little different than most blue-collar jobs because we actually live here.
I really don't. I wish I had the answer, because it would make life a whole hell of a lot easier for those coming up behind me. And I always look at it this way, I'm thick-skinned because I've been around it for so long that 90% of what is said or done, I just kind of shrug it off. So it doesn't bother me a whole lot, but I can honestly tell you, some of the stuff that I hear that's said, somebody new would be completely appalled and they wouldn't last. And I'm not saying that it has to do with management, because here's my thing. A lot of these places, they'll bring in a new chief, or we have a new sheriff, but you're still inheriting what's already been there prior to you. You'll get new hires, but it's almost, I hate to say it, it's almost like they get sucked into whatever that environment is. So, where's there a chance of change?
Now we're required to have, since 2005, a local union women's committee is one of the standing committees now that's required if there's female members in your local union. And no two committees run the same because there's so many different industries that we represent, so there's different needs. What I insists that they be as a network for women to bring issues forward on whether or not the workplace needs to change. As far as we still have some women that work on the railways in Canada, that actually work on the rail lines in Canada, that don't have restrooms and things to use, And so now we're starting to focus more on women's periods during work hours and menopause during work hours and whether or not a clean room for breastfeeding if they're bringing or pumping and things that way. So there's been a lot of work on those kind of issues as well as domestic violence and breast cancer in the workplace. That's a whole other safety issue. And we say Women of Steel is not just for women. It's to create dialogue and be a network for sisters to come to, or a base that maybe it's just learning who your union stewards are and becoming that network in the workplace where people know they can go somewhere and talk to a union sister and she can help.
I would definitely recommend a female come on the shop. It's needed. It's needed. We need air at this point. And I tell people it's a necessary evil that never going to have a utopian society. We're not going to have a perfect society. And I feel like laws and officers keep those people that are thinking, okay, well, maybe, but they don't want to go to jail. So it keeps that part of society away from the criminal aspect. Didn't have that, I don't know where we would be. I don't like to see people hurt, harmed, abused, no matter gender, race, whatever, sexual orientation. I hate to see that. I hate bullies. I hate any of that. I'm always rooting for the underdogs. It saddens me to see one group getting abused, murdered, attacked like that. It really makes me sad. But yeah, I definitely think we need law enforcement. We need diversity. We need women in law enforcement. We will always need laws. It never slowed down for us at all, because criminal activity takes no break. No seasonal break, no pandemic break. No, not at all.
After World War II, women tried to find economic freedom. They were expected to go back to their kitchens, but they didn't. They fought to stay in the workplace, and they weren't embraced by the traditional male union. So, women started to form caucuses and make demands. However, now in 2023, women are still not 100% embraced in blue-collar workplaces, and their basic needs aren't being met. Are there organizations like the Women of Steel that is a leadership development program that educates its union sisters, or Chicago Women in the Trades that recruits young women for blue-collar jobs and educates and supports women so that they can have the confidence to go into these professions?
I guess the piece of advice that I would, and what's missing, I think, from younger women who are doing non-trad work these days is really a support mechanism. Even if on all kinds of levels, the legal support, the lobbying, the legislation, the publicity about what you're doing and why it's important, or even just to vent, I mean, it's got to be so hard in some of those jobs. The only organization I know of outside of caucuses within individual unions are there's now it's been around since the late 70s in Chicago Women in the Trades, and it does it all. It recruits young women for blue collar jobs. It does pre-training so they can pass the tests at the apprenticeships. It does support work once they get hired. It does physical. They do the whole thing. And I know they've been around since the 70s. It's practically the only one I can think of that's still around.
The early women's caucuses of the steel workers that kind of formed during World War II. And after the war, they expected women to go back to their kitchens and their homes. And women said, no, we're staying in the workplace. We found economic freedom, by having good jobs. But employers expected women to go back when the men come back from the war, back into their homes. And the union never saw women as being permanent employees because they too expected that they would go back. Well, the women stayed in the workplaces as best they could, but they still weren't really embraced by the traditional male union. So the women formed caucuses and started making demands. And one of their demands was that we have an education program that teaches us how the union works. And we need a space in this union. And we have real issues because early on, women had to use the same restrooms as men, the same shower rooms as men with just a curtain dividing them. There was no maternity leave. There was nothing for women in the workplace. So, they had to figure it out. So they started fighting. Out of the early demands from the women's caucuses, the steelworkers developed an education program for women. Out of those demands. And then it was something called the Women's Union Education Program or something. And it started in Canada, and the women in Canada said, no, we want to name it ourselves, and we want it to be the Women of Steel Leadership Development Program. So that started formally in the late 80s. So Women of Steel then became a term of all women in this union, regardless of what industry they work in, became who we are. We are Women of Steel, and we have an education program. And it was first taught in the U.S. in 1992. The program has evolved, but the same standard segments of the program still exist today because it's built on the required committees, so we educate union sisters.
These are the stories of 10 women trying to make an honest living in a blue-collar world dominated by men. These women don't know each other, and the work these women have done spans 50 years in different professions. Yet, all 10 women mentioned similar hardships and experiences on their jobs. Using the grounded theory approach, I didn't see my chapters come together until I went through each woman's story and highlighted important terms and topics. Then I went back and saw the many similarities and connections in what these blue-collar women were saying. I went back again and color-coded each topic to come up with the chapters in this audiobook. Most of these 10 women feel isolated or lonely on their job. They are surrounded by men. Some men are helpful, others ignore them or try to push them out. But they have no women with whom they share their experiences. Uniforms matter to these women because they wear them every day. They're part of the job and part of what keeps them safe. Often, they don't fit. The women are troubled that pregnancy, a guaranteed right for every working woman, is not included in many of their work contracts. Many of these women told me that they love their job and the work that they get to do every day. They love their jobs despite the rude jokes or sexual harassment some face from the other people they work with. Some have been told they only got the job because they are a woman. Others have been called crude names. Some of the women wish more women were doing the jobs they do. What is the answer to how to get more women into blue-collar work? These women show that women are strong enough and able to do the work. Support from other blue-collar women might be the answer. Programs like the Women of Steel, which teaches and supports the women in their unions, and Chicago Women in the Trades, which helps young females get into technical schools and continues to support them after they have the job, can help boost the number of women in these blue-collar professions. If their numbers grow, these organizations might be able to help women combat harassment, get uniforms and equipment that fit them, and ensure they are guaranteed pregnancy leave. And women in blue-collar work might finally feel less isolated.